Hi guys, this is Ashley. Today we're going to read a book called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Read for you by Ashley. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive are proud to say that they're perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They're the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over the garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in her opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and a good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. Dursley shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing up with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up in the dull grey Tuesday hour, the story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things were soon to be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, picked Mrs. Dursley on a cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of the number 4 Privet Drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar: a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look at it again. There was a tabby cat standing in the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map at sight. What should he be thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. He was now reading a sign that said, "Privet Drive, no," looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw in young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell in the huddle of the weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that it was probably some silly stunt. These people are obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley around in the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back in drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 19th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road by doing himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large doughnut in a bag, that he caught a few words that they were saying. "The Potters. That's right, that's what I heard. Yes, that's their son Harry." Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers, as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finishing dialing the home number when he changed his mind. He put out the receiver, back down, and stroked his moustache, thinking. No, he had been stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had son called name Harry. Came to think of it, he wasn't sure his nephew was called Harry. He never had even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She was got to accept in any mention of a sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in close. He found it a little harder to concentrate in drills that afternoon, and when he had left that building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted, as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all set at being almost knocked on the ground. On the contrary, his face slipped into the wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passersby stare, "Don't be worried, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who was gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted in the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't approve his mind, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting in the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It hadn't the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, "won't." Mr. Dursley tried to look normally when Dudley had been put to bed. He went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. "And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls had suddenly changed their sleeping pattern." The newscaster allowed himself a grin. "Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?" Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not the only owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in on to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise and wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over the Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks and all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you hadn't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff in the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there are lots of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley slipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he told the name Potter. He decided he didn't care, unless he said as casually he could, "Their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they related a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over their mind. His last comforting thought, before he fell asleep, was that even the Potters were involved. There was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well when he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how the Petunia could mix up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. He couldn't affect them. How very strong he was! Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat in the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly in the far corner of the Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when the car door slammed in the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared in the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and slightly you had thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in the Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and a beard which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing a long robes, a purple cloak that swept in the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were right bright and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots and unwelcome. He's busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize he's been watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known."